Nostril piercing is going to be 5 advantages, 5 disadvantages, 5 pros, 5 cons. Coming up next on Season 2 of Pros and Cons by a Piercer, episode number 2. So stick around. For those who are new to the channel, my name is DaVo. I'm a professional body piercer and have been since 1994. I own and operate the Axiom Body Piercing Studio, located right here in Des Moines, Iowa, inside Skin Kitchen Tattoo. So, when I talk to you about these things, I'm talking with a level of expertise that comes from being in the body piercing industry for well over 26 years. So, what are we going to cover today? This is the new format for Season 2. We're going to cover the pros and cons like we always have. We're also going to cover what you should know a little bit beforehand, what the healing or the piercing experience is going to be like, what healing it's going to be like, and jewelry options, and living with the piercing, and then we're going to finish off with what happens if you think you want to abandon the piercing. Because I know a lot of people think about that even before they get it pierced. What if I don't like it or what have you? So we'll go through that too. Start off with, let's talk a little bit about what this piercing is and what the history of this piercing is. Nostril piercings usually are placed on the side of the nose, usually in this natural curvature or a ridge or indentation. When people flare their nostrils, you'll notice there's that ridge. Even with people that don't have that really pronounced ridge, generally what we'll do is we'll pierce directly through that and into the nostril. Thus, we're piercing the nostril. It's even mentioned in the Bible. Even though the modern translation calls it an ear ring or a golden ear ring, in Genesis 24:22, what they're really talking about is a nostril ring or nose ring is what the original Hebrew version of it is. It has a history that is probably tied mostly to Indian culture, dating back to, as far as recorded, back to the 16th century. And it is the Indian tradition to have it pierced on the right side because it supposedly helps with childbirth, makes it easier. The piercing is also represented in a lot of indigenous cultures and tribal cultures in Africa and also North America. I guess its first introduction to most of the general public would have been through the 60s and 70s subcultures. Of course, the counterculture of the 1960s. A lot of people who went to India to kind of look for this new enlightenment and et cetera, following the Beatles and so forth. They came back with these. However, it is probably best associated or most associated with the punk rock movement of the 1970s. I know it's the first time I experienced it. It was a pretty common piercing, usually done incorrectly and poorly. It was common to see somebody at a show probably back in the late 80s or mid to late 80s with one and a terrible piece of jewelry they bought at the mall, probably Spencer's gifts, and maybe a chain hanging off of it, and the thing being bright red and infected. That was a pretty common thing that you would see. When piercing came about in kind of the profession of piercing or modern piercing, it became more standardized, increasingly more available and safely and et cetera. And kind of through the alternative culture of the 1990s, grunge, whatever you want to call it, that is really where it took on and kind of became a part of pop culture. Now that you know something about the history of nostril piercings, let's talk about the pros, the cons, the advantages, the disadvantages. Starting off the pros. Number 1, this piercing is very socially acceptable. It has gotten to the point where pretty much most people kind of consider it normal. I would say it's the most common piercing, or second most common piercing that you're going to see out there. The first one, of course, being lobe piercings. But it is pretty acceptable for people to have this, especially females. Number 2, this piercing has a long, very long, 4,000 to 5,000 years history of healing fairly easily. It does have its issues, but usually if you take care of it properly, you're going to heal pretty easily. Number 3, this piercing is not prone to rejection, migration, and all the other issues that other piercings sometimes are prone to. This piercing usually will not move or shift, etc., because it's through the cartilage, and that tends to kind of keep it where it's supposed to be. Number 4, there is an extremely large variety of different types of jewelry that you can wear in this. There are 4 major styles, and I'll go a little bit more into this later. Rings, of course, L-bins, labret studs, nostril screws. The ends on these can be a large variety of different types, gems, elegant, simple, etc. Also, the rings come in various different colors, designs, and etc. Etc., etc., etc. Just a lot of jewelry out there because it's a popular piercing. So there's a lot of people out there looking for stuff. Number 5, this piercing draws attention and enhances the beauty of the area. It can be subtle, it can be elegant, it can be outlandish, it can be very bold. But the thing is it tends to draw attention to the area and it tends to enhance it. It doesn't look like a foreign thing. And a lot of people, if it's done correctly, it looks like it belongs there. Now, with the pros out of the way, let's move on to the cons, the disadvantages, the things that we don't particularly care for. The first one is this can affect, even though I did say it's become more socially acceptable, it can still affect employment and it can affect your ability to play organized sports. It really depends on the field of work that you're doing and whether or not you're interacting with the general public and if you're in a corporation of some sort. The more professional level places are not going to be as accepting as, say, even the medical industry or jobs working in the food service industry. The thing is that pretty much if you have to wear a suit and tie to work, they're not going to accept the fact that you have a nostril piercing. Also, I have noticed that it seems more acceptable for females to have this piercing than males, so that's another thing. As far as organized sports, many of the high school, college, in below, down into middle school, etc., many of these organizations that govern over them have outlawed or regulated against any type of visible piercings. They say it's for safety. I think it's more for uniform. I don't know how. Oh, it's not safe to have that. You can hurt somebody else with that. Well, if anybody that knows anything about body piercing jewelry, there's usually not sharp edges that are going to harm anybody else. But it is something that you are going to probably have to remove if you are going to compete competitively. You should check with your coach before getting it done or read the rule book because it'll be written in there if it's going to be a problem. I know a lot of times coaches will say, it's not a big issue, don't worry about it. And then I've had clients that have ended up at a game or a meet, and suddenly they're required to take the jewelry out. So check ahead of time. Number 2, you cannot sleep on this piercing while it's healing. Even though a lot of people think that it's fine to do that, most of the problems that I see with nostril piercings can pretty much be traced back to people sleeping on them. You need to sleep on your other side or your back, and you should take that into consideration when choosing a side that you want to pierce. Number 3, cannot wear makeup, especially foundation makeup, in the area until it is completely healed. Wearing makeup in the area can cause or lead to glandular cysts and other problems. It just gets into the piercing and it causes issues. Also, I'd be cautious of using any type of facial cleaner that tingles or seems abrasive during the healing process. Number 4, this piercing can, in some cases, be prone to scarring. Like I mentioned with the glandular cyst, it is prone occasionally to bumps. Both of those things can cause long-term scarring and something that's very noticeable. Though that's not always the case. With a healthy piercing, most people don't even notice the things there in the first place, even with the jewelry out. Number 5, because of the fact that this piercing does swell and where it's located at and the amount of tissue we go through, this jewelry usually has to be very oversized during the healing process. This can make it for a little bit more movement. This can also cause issues, especially with L-bins and nostril screws, that they're not quite as secure as they would be if they were tighter. So that's something you do need to be cautious about, and I'll get a little bit more into that when we get in. Now with the pros and the cons out of the way, let's move on to things that you should look for. You should find a piercer, of course, even though this is considered kind of a standard staple piercing that everybody does. It's always a good idea to find a piercer that's experienced, that has done a lot of these. If the piercing is done incorrectly, you're going to have issues from beginning to end. The other thing is, an experienced piercer is going to be able to place it where it looks right, and they're also going to give you a piece of jewelry to put in there that's going to be sized correctly and be made of the correct material, and etc. So do your research beforehand. When you go in for the piercer should give you a short consultation that should include risks, what the aftercare is going to involve. They should talk to you a little bit about jewelry selection, etc. And they should cover any type of sensitivities you have to metal or any of the materials that they may be using or products they may be using during the process. Next, your piercer should evaluate your anatomy and determine what type of jewelry is going to work best and what size is going to work best. If you are planning on putting a ring in there, this is one of the times that I would suggest mentioning this. A lot of people don't think about this, but to put a ring in, the ring has to wrap comfortably all the way around the bottom of the nostril. If it isn't placed so that could happen, it could cause problems, huge problems, when you try to switch over to a ring. So even if you're getting pierced with a stud initially, which is your best option, to be honest with you, you should talk to your piercer and let them know that you eventually want to wear a ring in this piercing, because it can dictate how they place that piercing. Last thing you should look for, I know that it's the fashion to have the smallest ring possible in your nostril. The thing is that the jewelry, if you get pierced with a ring, or even when you wear a ring later, it's a good idea to have it loose. It will probably need to be oversized if you're piercing initially. I generally try to talk people out of the idea of piercing with a nostril, but I have to say that in my experience of 26 odd years, for the first 16 of it, I pretty much had everybody heal it out with a ring. The problems, maybe a little bit more than it was with nostril screws, but it's still possible. The thing is that the jewelry needs to be larger to make the area that's inside the piercing as flat as possible. If you put in these really tiny 5/16 rings or 7mm rings and etc., you create this situation where it has an arch to it, and that alone can cause huge issues when healing out a nostril piercing. So now let's talk a little bit about the piercing experience. The piercing is usually done freehand. Everybody has their own little methods to this one. Either they're going to put a cork inside your nose or a needle receiving tube in most cases to support the tissue on the inside and make the piercing go smoothly and quickly. Some piercers will use forceps. There's really nothing wrong with it. It just seems weird to me because I've never considered it a good idea, but it is possible. I've also encountered piercers that one side they'll do with a cork or a needle receiving tube, and the other side they just feel more comfortable doing it with forceps. That's not uncommon. So do talk to your, don't be surprised if it's either or. The piercing is usually a very quick piercing. We don't use really thick needles or thick jewelry, so that needle generally passes through the area fairly quickly and smoothly. Usually there'll be a sharp pain followed by a little bit of maybe throbbing and aching that'll fade in a few minutes. This piercing can bleed sometimes. There's no way, even if you candle where you stick a powerful light inside the nostril and try to figure out where the blood vessels are, it's not really easy to figure out where those blood vessels are, and you don't sometimes know until you actually do the piercing. So sometimes it's not uncommon to nick a little blood vessel and see bleeding for maybe a minute or two after the piercing is done. It's not something you should be concerned about. Usually it will stop and clot, and your body will make plenty of more blood. Another thing that's a common reaction when getting a nostril piercing is for you to tear up. We know this isn't because you're a wimp or because it hurts so much. This has more to do with we did something to your sinuses, and just like pulling a nose hair or sneezing, it tends to make your eyes water. So that's common. Don't feel weird about it. It's just something that happens. It's a natural, what are they called? It's a natural reflex. So now let's talk about healing. Average healing on this one, anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks. I do suggest using sterile saline twice daily. Also practicing cross-contamination prevention. That's things like keeping your environment clean, washing your hands before you handle it, not over-handling the piercing, not submerging the piercing in bodies of water you can't control the quality of, keeping pets away from it, keeping unclean objects away from it, not sleeping on it, that sort of stuff. Keeping the piercing isolated and keeping things away from it that might introduce microorganisms that can lead to an infection. So, basically, isolate the piercing. The first 3 to 5 days, it's not uncommon to see redness, discolorization, heat, tenderness to the touch, inflammation or swelling. It's also uncommon to have tenderness to the touch. The reason why I said that twice is often people go, it hurts. I've had it done for 5 days and it hurts. Well, when does it hurt? It hurts when I touch it. Don't touch it. Touching it is, and if it hurts, is your body saying, don't mess with it. So, if it hurts because you touch it, that's normal. Just stop touching it. The piercing should be monitored for bumps and cysts and etc. The nostrils sometimes are prone to this. And the two main leading causes to this, in my opinion, are makeup, foundation makeup especially, and sleeping on the piercing. What happens with this piercing is usually after a week or two, it will no longer hurt to have pressure against it. So people go, oh, it's healed enough to sleep on. And then they start sleeping on it, and the constant pressure and movement of sleeping on it will cause your body to kind of build up a blister-like sore to protect itself from what it's considered abusive. So, and once that starts, they can be very difficult to get rid of, and they're damn ugly. And this is on your face. So make sure that you're sleeping on your other side or your back. And always consider that when picking a side to get pierced. Because right now we're still involved with the pandemic, you want to make sure that the masks are pulled as far away from the piercing as possible. You want to be very cautious when you remove the mask that you don't catch the jewelry. And you should change your mask often. Clean them. If you're using cloth ones 2-3 times a day, you should be putting a new one on. If you're using the disposable ones, usually if you remove it, it should be thrown away. It shouldn't be put back on. So change them often and be very cautious when you remove them. This one's important, especially if you were pierced with a nostril screw or an L-bend. Be very cautious when you're changing your clothing, cleaning your face, or drying off after you get out of the shower. Because that style of jewelry uses wire on the inside of your nose to basically keep it from falling out, it's not uncommon to catch them, and they flip out on their own, and they can be very difficult to get back in. And usually they land in the most disgusting thing near you. Once the piercing is healed, these can be bent and adjusted to make them more secure. But during the healing process, be very cautious and avoid contact as much as possible. Now let's talk about jewelry options. Basically, there are 4 different types that you can put in a nostril. The first type is probably one of the more common ones, and that's nostril screws. This is like a question mark bent in half, and the curvature sits on the inside of your nose. The next one down would be an L-bend. Though those are not as common anymore. They're kind of the same concept, except they don't have that curvature on the inside. So they are less secure. The next one would be labret studs. These have kind of picked up in popularity over the last few years, last decade or so. The advantage to them is they are very secure and they're a stud. The disadvantage to them is they can be difficult to change, especially if it's threaded jewelry. You basically have to figure out some way of gripping that jewelry on the inside. If it is the push pin or threadless, they can be fairly easy to remove, but they can be difficult to put back in. One of the most common ways to remove that in is by using the floss method. Take a length of floss, tie a slip knot on one side, thread it over that disc on the inside, tighten it up, secure it, and then pull off the outside. Usually it'll make it fairly easy to take it out. Now, getting the jewelry back in is going to be complicated because you have to find that hole on the inside of your nose, and that's not easy. Usually you're going to need a taper pin to guide the jewelry in. It is a lot more complicated. Then you might need, on top of that, forceps to actually be able to put it in, because it's kind of hard to stick 2 fingers up your nose. I'm sure there's somebody that can. Lastly, rings. Rings basically are a better option after the piercing is well healed in season. And the reason I say that is we are taking a straight line and then we are suddenly arching it. This is especially true if you want a really small, tight-fitting ring. The longer you wait, I would say upwards of 6 months, the better outcome you're going to have. A common thing that I see, and I see this in comments and I've seen this in real life, is people get the piercing healed and it's beautiful. They heal it out with a nostril screw or a labret stud. It has been fantastic, no issues, nothing. Then they switch to that tiny itty bitty ring that they've longed for, and then suddenly there's all these problems. There's bumps, there's redness, it looks like it's infected. This is because you've drastically changed that, and your body really hasn't had enough time to season that piercing, thicken it up, and make it a little bit more like normal tissue. So if you wait long enough, usually it's not a problem, but understand that putting that pressure on the piercing, especially soon after it heals, is usually asking for issues. Now let's talk about living with the piercing. With this piercing, it's best to leave jewelry in at all times. They can close fairly rapidly. It's not usually an issue to remove them for short periods of time, like maybe if you have some type of medical procedure. But for the most part, it's a good idea to keep something in it, especially for the first 2 to 3 years. With any piercing, avoid trauma and pressure on the piercing. You can have a healed piercing and then it gets caught on something and it can rip the piercing. This one, because it's on your face and it's a high contact area, is prone to that. So keep things away from it. Learn that kind of isolation technique during the healing process and continue to practice that after it heals. The next thing is, especially if you have a nostril screw, if you have stud-style jewelry and you want to stick with stud-style jewelry. If you have a nostril screw or an L-bend, you need to see your piercer and have them adjust it and tighten it so that it's not quite so loose, so you don't have to worry about the jewelry falling out randomly on its own. If you have labret studs, it's a good idea to go to a shorter barbell to reduce the amount of movement that piercing is going to have, or that jewelry is going to have. So it's always a good idea to have it adjusted or have it changed to a shorter post once the piercing is healed. And it's not bad to wait maybe 3-4 months into the process so that it's well healed. Lastly, let's talk about abandoning the piercing. If you come to a point where you say, I don't want it anymore or what have you, usually what will happen is the piercing will close in a few days. It'll kind of reconnect in the center, and then your body will slowly begin to fill up those 2 holes. With nostril piercings, because we usually pierce them at thinner gauges, like 18 or 20 gauge, it doesn't really leave a large hole. So usually they're not that noticeable. It usually kind of looks like maybe a deep pore, and that's about it. As far as anything you need to do additionally, it's a good idea to keep an eye on a piercing anytime you take the jewelry out and decide to abandon it. Usually it'll heal over with no issue or problem. You don't really have to worry about infection or anything else. Now, if it's during the healing process, yes, you should treat it like any other open wound and practice cross-contamination prevention, keep the area clean, and keep an eye on it. So, that pretty much covers the pros and cons of nostril piercings and a bunch of other information. If you found this edifying, helpful, and informative, give me a thumbs up. Let me know that you liked it, because we like it when you like it. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. Hit that notification bell so that you're notified every single time we post something. If I brought up any questions that you would like to have answered, or maybe you have something unrelated, please leave a comment. That's what the comment section's for. I try to check them and answer them when I have time. If you like merch, you like swag, you like to, stuff that has to do with body art, check out our merch store. Link is in the description. Lots of designs, lots of colors, and lots of different products. Till next time, here's hoping all your piercings heal with ease and without a single issue. And if you're in the Des Moines, Iowa area, I hope to see your body piercing needs in the future. Have a good day, everybody. Take care. Take care of everyone else. And we'll see you in the next video.